packet pushers.
Hello and welcome to the Network Automation Nerds podcast, the podcast where we explore the latest in network automation and the stories that connect us all. I'm your host, Eric Cho, and co-host with me is Ethan Banks. In today's sponsor episode by Network to Code, we're joined by esteemed guests Josh Watkins, Eric Henson, and David Izil from Cox Communications, the largest private broadband company in the United States. They will shed light on their motivation for network automation, lessons learned, some of the memorable moments, and imagine this, the story behind maintaining the network at DEF CON Hacker Convention, where the users hack networks for a living. Stay tuned as we uncover the trials, tribulations, and triumphs of network automation at Cox Communications. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. First, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your company?
Yeah, thanks for having us. I think it's awesome to be able to talk about network automation with you guys. It's a passion that my team has and we share. There's a lot of opportunity in MSO space. I'm David Izil. I'm the Director of Network Automation at Cox. I've been doing this for about 5 years now. I historically have been in the software technology space. I've been doing consulting most of my life from a lot of enterprise integration, app dev, that sort of thing. And I came into Cox with, eyes wide open, coming into the kind of the MSO cable industry for the first time. And Josh Watkins is here from day one when we started this team. And it was fascinating, kind of some of the things that, a legacy network and kind of how they manage it and some of the software disciplines that I'm kind of used to. I'm like, wait, we don't do things certain ways here. And so it was a challenge I was happy to jump into. I did a little bit of project management, program management before I actually officially took on my job. It was kind of a catalyst in Cox where they were getting to a point where they needed to deploy, the next generation of remote physical devices out in the node. We had this thing called RFI, and it was kind of a transformation in Cox itself because they were basically going from an analog network into more of a digitized network. And that required us to be more sophisticated in the way that we manage software. And organizationally, we weren't aligned to it because effectively we were moving more intelligence out closer to the home. Right. And that required an entire organization and our outside plant team to kind of start collaborating closely with our main telecom centers. Organizationally, those teams never really kind of talked to each other. So a lot of the initial engagements, we had to kind of design software solutions that kind of orchestrated our ability to provision these new digitized type of network devices into the network. And kind of the genesis of our team was off the heels of us actually implementing something like that because Cox took a very automation first mindset to it where, hey, we're not going to be able to scale the deployments of these things without going out the gate with automation. We're not going to be able to, increase our workforce at the same rate that we're going to need to do this. We're talking, thousands upon thousands of provisioned network devices. And so that was kind of the catalyst that started this kind of network automation team that we have here. And a lot of the software best practices blended with a lot of the network engineering knowledge and best practices were kind of combined into a joint team and really was allowing us to be very successful in that deployment and allowed us to effectively scale out, with automation and not increase kind of our workforce at the same time. And then I'll let Josh and Eric kind of get into their intros and stuff. They have a lot of history in some of our brownfield network. So if you think about everything that we're doing is kind of net new greenfield style, there's a lot of different considerations and challenges there. But in the brownfield side, and what Eric and Josh kind of talk about, it's orders of magnitude harder to kind of influence things that are already there, introduce new concepts, new practices. There's a lot of challenges there I'm sure we'll get into later in the talk.
So before we meet Josh and Eric, David, I did have a question for you that you said kind of an analog to digital legacy network and moving to new stuff. Can you shine a little light on what that was?
Yeah, absolutely. At a very high level, right? When we think about the converged cable access platforms where voice, video, and data that gets fed out from our main telecom centers across the country into effectively, MUX, DMUX, MDMs down to, nodes in the network and amplifiers down to your home. There are two aspects of it. There's like your HFC hybrid fiber coaxial network. So you got fiber down, to a node and then coax down to the house. That's your DOCSIS kind of side of things. And then you have your fiber to the home, which is your PON, optical network. And, we work in both aspects of that. So when we talked about remote PHY, that was in the DOCSIS side, where we were trying to take what was traditionally in just what we call the CCAP and the MTCs. They were trying to break out some of that and move it, into a digital node. So think about, that kind of, green box at the end of your street or near in your neighborhood that is connected with fiber, and then you're fed, coax from there. That's what we're talking about. Provisioning those, putting more smarts in that, and then eventually putting more smarts in the amplifiers and getting more information on the network and all of that sort of thing. So that's what I was referring to.
Yeah, that's awesome. As I was telling you guys before the mic was on, I was in the MSO network, and that's why I'm so excited to hear about the latest. I mean, I was part of that triple play launch for the MSO I was with. So, David, you mentioned, Josh was here from day one. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about what that was like. And brownfield is ultimately probably X amount of times harder than greenfield. So, excited to hear about, how'd you get here, Josh? I mean, did you always dream up of being like a network engineer when you were little, or what I want to be when I grow up?
I would say completely opposite of what I thought I would be doing for my career at Cox. I'll start with my introduction. I'm Josh Watkins. I'm an enterprise network automation developer here at Cox, and I've worked across nearly every corner of the business, from front lines in the call center doing tech support to data analytics, and eventually finding that place where I thrive, and that was network engineering. So a lot of my career in the last probably 10 to 12 years has been in the network engineering space, and then the latter part being in network automation. I didn't see myself doing either of those two things, to be honest. I don't know what I saw myself doing, but I think that's one of the great things about an MSO is there's so many different positions and facets to running a business like this and being a service provider that you have that flexibility to find that career path that makes sense for you. So for me, network automation came naturally as things progressed with network engineering. Frankly, it got hard, right? It was difficult to keep up. We're doing night maintenances. You have a huge inventory of devices. So we were working a lot of nights. And I said, I think I need to start teaching myself how to script. So it starts at VB scripts and Python and Ansible. And before you know it, you're doing some network automation, right? It just blossoms from there.
Yeah, I was part of that crew that do the nightly maintenance. I mean, I remember even in the early 2000s, the maintenance window was between like midnight to like 6 a.m. And it just gradually shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. By the time 4.5 years later, it was like 3 hours. And, it's mid of the night, you're taking all these equipment, go to hub site, where like these hub sites are so remote that you can't even find it. And now you're like in there doing the silent alarm. Yeah, so all of those, man.
Yeah, that was a great point. Eric and I both work down in regions of the country that Cox actually services, right? So we're both employees and customers. And some of these sites where our gear is at is just out in the woods. It's like a building that is down a dirt road 2 hours away. So, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you got your compact flash card to go into one of these buildings and do upgrades. And before you know it, that maintenance window is shrinking, right? To your point, Eric, that you have validation to do. So it might take 2 hours just to get the upgrades done, but then you have another hour of validations on top of that. And automation is going to help you out on both ends there.
Yeah, what about you, Eric? Were you similar to Josh where network automation came natural to you? Or was it something that happened where you just have that aha moment and so, oh, you know what? Actually, there's got to be a better way. So I'd love to hear your story.
Yeah, it kind of developed over time. I mean, just like Josh, I've had a bunch of roles within the company. Started off as a field tech, installing Cox business services, climbing under buildings, through attics, running cable, that sort of thing. And from there, I kind of move up into our telephony, kind of in a sales support type role. And then my interest has always been technology, engineering, getting hands-on with equipment. So moving into that sales support role, I had a little more time on my hands where I could go around and see what other functions were available in the Cox company and started talking to some engineers, met cool people like Josh, met some people like our local network engineers. And they said, if you have an interest in this, they said, come shadow for a little while, see if it's something you want to do. So fast forward a couple years, and then I got a job doing network engineering. So that was working with Nokia gear, Cisco gear. I mean, at the MSOs, we just have a ton of different equipment. It's a lot to learn, and I don't think you'll ever be proficient in anything, but it was just awesome to have that opportunity. So with working on this whole variety of gear, there's a definite need for automation, like just trying to keep up with these maintenance windows that you're talking about. You only have X amount of time, and dealing especially with Cox business customers like Josh and I did, you got to get it done in that window. These customers do not care if you tell them you ran out of time. That's not their problem.
Yeah.
So it came out of a need to ensure that we're consistent, accurate, and quick with our maintenances. And I remember one time, Josh could tell you, he was doing the maintenance and I was helping him, and the lack of automation accidentally pasted the wrong line of code into a piece of gear. And I was like, Josh, you remember what I said? What I say?
Yeah, it was just dead silent. It's probably 3:30 in the morning. He's like, you know what you just did, right? And I did know. And I was just frozen and just panicking. And it really is the largest network outage I've ever caused was by not having automation. And I simply hit the right click of my mouse and it pasted into my terminal. I wiped out an entire city's business services in one click of the mouse. So working together, though, that's one thing that I will say about Eric and I is that you kind of hear this term of like pair programming a lot of times when it comes to developing developer topics. And I think that really is part of our DNA in the network engineering space. We always were watching each other's backs where one person's doing the work, one person's doing the thinking, so that we have kind of that full brain capacity to work on a network this large. And while I was frozen, Eric jumped into action and got things recovered. So yeah, fun times. That everyone has one, right? We all have that story where we caused the network outage, and that was mine.
Josh, if I go to that city, is your face on a wanted poster?
Probably. I wouldn't want to wear, a Cox shirt at the grocery store in that city. It would probably be a bad idea.
Maybe the next day when everything's fixed and you're just like, with that halo on top. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I may or may not have cried a bit when I heard that story because I was that dude, right? Like sitting at the floor of the data center where I know I just caused an outage and now I'm trying to recover, trying to do the dial in for the console for, management interface. But something that I heard is kind of interesting to me when you're just talking about Josh is that you guys do actually pair programming ish network engineering operations. And that is not something that I've heard often. Usually we have a network engineer who's like the hero and who's have that hero mentality where he goes in and do that. Is that something that is unique to Cox, or is that something unique to your team that you developed, David? Or how did that work?
Well, like organizationally, like Josh and Eric are kind of the gold standard is like how to work together effectively, right? And not everybody has the depth of experience in both the network and software that these two have. We call them unicorns, right? And it's hard to find unicorns. So a lot of the model that we have in this is obviously we're very passionate about helping our network engineers learn new skills. We want to help them kind of grow and to understand that, hey, the next generation way of managing these networks, you're going to have to understand these software engineering kind of disciplines and methodologies. And so for us, it's very important that we provide an environment that, very strong network engineers that maybe have a passion for automation can work with either folks like, Josh and Eric that have done this before, they have the how to go about it, or, we have, if Josh and Eric isn't, we have like a software engineer that we can pair them up with. So at least they have that duality of knowledge that they can understand from each other and learn from each other and hopefully, build from both sides so we can kind of develop more unicorns as we go. In the future, we'll have kind of a herd of unicorns or whatever, if that's a term.
You said software development and describe Josh and Eric as unicorns because they have the network engineering experience, but they're also software developers. Is that truly what we're talking about here, software development? Because network automation, it's really broad, right? It could be software development where you're truly writing code and building a platform that's unique to your company, but it could also be stitching together a bunch of platforms with glue code, let's say, to bring it all together.
I think that's a great question, Ethan, because I think at different parts of our career, both Eric and I, at the beginning and what it looks like today, it starts with like scripts and we're maybe not software development. We're really automating the network, Ansible, Python, NetMiko, right? We're getting real hands-on with the gear. That led to more real, tangible software platforms. Eric and I both we're actually co-authors of a US patent for software that Eric and I wrote that basically efficiently discovers the topology of our fiber network for Cox Business. And we're talking about a network that spans 65,000 nodes, over 6,000 fiber rings that these nodes live on. And you need to know the order of the devices, how many devices, are they online, are they offline? And there was no tool in the space that really could provide that level of performance. So we wrote it. And I would say that both sides of the coin, whether it's getting down and dirty with the devices themselves and wrangling them into compliance, or writing software that we need to meet the scale and demand that we have as a service provider is part of it.
And that was like really iterative on that. It wasn't an overnight type thing. So that was, we were working maintenance windows mainly with Nokia rings at the time. And, one of the steps was to make sure the ring was in good status. The neighborships were all formed, all the protocols that should be up are up, that sort of thing. And my background, I've got a bachelor's of science in game development of all things. How I ended up here is a story for another day, but used kind of my background in that to start with a C# app that we actually worked on and let techs use so they could run it. It would reach out to the network, do a couple checks, and kind of green light them before a maintenance. So that evolved into like a larger C# app that then had different modes where you could, upgrade firmware, migrate equipment, that sort of thing. Then I was talking to Josh and he floated the idea of, hey, if we put this on a server and have it run all the time, do you think we could set up some sort of monitoring with that? Something that's useful. So then that's where we came up with the idea for something we ended up calling Ring Health, which is what our patent is based on. That was like the big kickoff to our automation start. Everyone was like, oh, wow, this is cool. And we're like, if we did that, we can do more of that. So the ideas kept rolling at that point.
Well, it's funny. Some of the biggest technical commitments show up when someone asks you, what if we could? And then it turns into a thing.
The scope creep never ends.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing. You talked about pair work and pair programming and kind of starting there, right? And it's a tale that I've seen not just in the network space, but in other places where talented people decide to solve a problem and they use software to do that. And they eventually get to a point where they're delivering, they're adding a lot of value, and success leads to success, and people want more. And a lot of times they end up kind of continuing on this path of building more and more stuff, and they get to a point where they can't really sustain it anymore, right? And so what we were trying to do is the passion that these guys have is something you want to harness. Right? You want to say, okay, I know you know this space inside and out, and you have this knowledge and understanding of, hey, we need to kind of apply some software solutions to this to make it maintainable and scalable. Where my job comes in is kind of, okay, how can I harness that, but then supplement it with kind of more of a team-based model where we can say, all right, it's not just an engineering hero building the software and stuck for years maintaining the thing that they don't want anything to do with after a little while. How can we move that into more of a sustaining and enterprise function that allows us to kind of continue to do that type of great work, but do it in a more scalable and sustainable way that's more team-based versus individual-based?
I think that's a great point. And if you guys allow me for a moment to congratulate you, because that was the first time that I heard from my guests that they actually have written a software that's US patent pending, right? So, congratulations, guys. That was the first time out of like 3 years of doing this. So that's pretty awesome. So you guys also mentioned, like the tool stack. Some of them you wrote, of course, the scope, we just keep on expanding. But build versus buy has always been like an issue, right? Everybody I talk to, that's always the first thing that they talked about. So tell us, what is kind of your thought process on build versus buy, and what is kind of your tool stack today?
I guess we'll give the frontline guys perspective, and then we'll let the boss man tell you. So it's one of those things where build versus buy, you might not always get the opportunity to do either one of them. It might be budget season and buying is not an option. So building becomes the thing. I think we have to really take stock in how much scale we're dealing with and what the maintenance of that is. It's easy to build something and turn it on that first time, right? To keep it going, keep it sustained, keep it maintained, security vulnerabilities, these types of things, that takes effort. So when we're looking for platforms, whether we're thinking about building or buying, we have to really look at does this solve the problem, but also what resources is it going to take to sustain and maintain that?
Yeah, it's not necessarily one decision that Cox has made to either build or buy. It's all going to be situation dependent. And some stuff that I've built, I look back and wish we would have bought it because, our end users are relentless sometimes if something doesn't work right. So having that support model is a huge benefit of buy. But at the same time, the flexibility you get with build is just something that our users love as well. So we really have to evaluate it case by case.
Eric, is it a headcount thing? That is, if you're going to commit to doing the development in-house, you got to commit some number of man hours to it in perpetuity, really, a platform like this. But does it also get to a point where it's like, okay, we don't need one or two developers, we need more?
Yeah, and how do you come up with that number up front, right? Like you could say that this thing's only going to support a limited number of devices and have a handful of users, and then word of mouth gets out, and now you're in a situation where you don't have the staffing to support it, or your one guy, your Superman guy, is stuck working on that, and you need them for other things. So how you do that upfront calculation is the hard part.
And can you get the headcount? How hard has it been to hire people when you need them? Because every place I've worked, that's always been a challenge. Like, we'll buy you whatever software you want. You want to hire someone for the team? No, not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great call out. I see that as a large deficiency in a lot of companies that say, hey, we bought the thing, right? But the thing doesn't really matter as much as the people doing the thing and the organizational alignment to allowing those people to do that thing the right way into perpetuity, right? That's where they always fail. They get so tied up in the tech and the platform that they just don't even think about the operating model behind it, right? And that's where it constantly just cycles itself and people, burn out because they said, hey, I'm going to build this thing, but I'm not really supported and I got two jobs and, I can't do both. And I see it constantly everywhere. So yeah, from my perspective, I guess if we want to talk about my view on things, so I came from enterprise integration, COTS applications like Siebel's and SAPs and things like that. A lot of enterprise middleware type of integrations with Oracle and stuff. So I have a different perspective on build versus buy that's kind of been shaped over being able to do that sort of thing, but also be able to build new software in startups and then be able to understand the value of open source, open standards, API integrations, and the decoupling that allows you to basically have that decision is an environment now that I truly value, right? So I am less on a proponent of buying the big, huge tool that costs a lot of money and a lot of licenses and a lot of vendor engagement to get it to work. I'm very much an open source advocate. I think that if you just bring some talented individuals to talk about the problem space and understands the technology nuances to say, I know this thing does this thing very well. And as long as I can integrate it with this other thing that does it pretty well, then it makes it easier for me to introduce new modular bits of code and services and functions to kind of stitch it together based off the use case that we may have in the network, that you're not going to find a product on the shelf that already does that for you. Because even if you buy that, off the shelf thing, they call it custom off the shelf for a reason. You need a vendor to come in and implement and customize that solution for your needs anyway. So there's just a lot of opportunity to reduce your cost and increase your velocity when you do that. But obviously you have that sustainability, that support kind of concern. So as long as when I'm making decisions, if we can come out with, yes, I know we have the skill sets to build it and we have the best of breed kind of open source technologies to build it with, that's all great. Can I support it and sustain it, make sure it's secure, it's scalable, it's monitored, and how are we going to operate this thing going into the future if, for whatever reason, the people that built it leave, right? That's where my focus is.
Yeah, and talking about skill sets, I mean, David, I know you've seen this challenge firsthand, but when we've got these applications that are so network centric, if you're looking for someone to do the software side and you pull in a full stack developer, I mean, how much of the time of your network engineers goes to training these full stack developers how the network works and how to write software to interact with it?
Yeah, 100%.
I think that's what we struggle with. I mean, I'm employee for Network to Code, and we deal with network social truth, and we actually go into companies to consult them, help them out, and stuff. So I think that's kind of what goes into what you were talking about, David, on you want to have pieces that work well together by default, but also have the option of swapping them out if needed be. And the bonus would be if this is a skill set you could actually, it's not so specialized that you could go out to the marketplace and kind of swap out those pieces. Because, as you mentioned, the unicorns are very hard to find. We call them unicorns for a reason. And they're very hard to replace, really, and to even do the knowledge transfer because it requires a certain amount of baseline to build upon.
I was just going to mention that, that's why, in my viewpoint, when I think about, the service provider network and where do we grow, where do we invest, I've always been an advocate of you have to start with a network engineer and grow them into the software space, because you're not going to be able to bring a bunch of software engineers and have them grow into the network space. It's just not as effective. And so we're passionate about like that culture of automation, kind of teaching people to fish and kind of growing them into network engineers that have that software discipline. And that's kind of where our focus is, and at least in Cox.
That's awesome because I've been in an environment where the attitude was the opposite. They try to bring software engineer into the network engineering space. And, I would have to say the success rate was like 50%, if that. It's really hard to make the software engineers that where they're kind of the plumbers and they don't want to specialize in one thing because they just want to know C#, for example, or Python. And that makes their skill set transferable where they view network engineers as being very silo, very specialized. And so there's always that resistance of going in. So it's very refreshing to hear you talked about how you want to have a network engineering centric point of view. So since, I deal with network source of truth all the time. So let's talk about that a little bit, Eric. Maybe you could shed some light into what kind of network source of truth you use, or, how do you deal with it? How does it play a role in your network automation journey?
That goes back to one of the things we are talking about on the mentality of the MSO we work for, on the buy versus build type thing. I mean, they've got their idea of what system they want to use for a source of truth. But the issue that they've had since the whole time I've been working for the company is a lot of their sources of truth are ones that are built from human input. So the accuracy there is questionable. And that leads to a source you really can't trust. And we can't really call it a source of truth at that point, can we?
No.
So Nautobot, as far as being used as a source of truth, we've got a couple ways that we kind of solve that gap, because a lot of our engineers have made side of the desk type tools that pull live data from the network. So we can correlate that with some of these static tools that do have human input and kind of come up with some sort of consensus on which has the correct data. And that's several different systems. So luckily, Nautobot's got the whole source of truth plugins, single source of truth plugins or extensions or apps or whatever they're called now. You guys have done a lot of work with those.
Right.
They've really evolved.
The drivers. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And we pull data from a bunch of different systems to build what we've got in Nautobot right now. And I like to think that Nautobot has become the most accurate source of truth that we have. So, and since we've got that running, a lot of these other teams are taking interest in that. It's like, hey, can we pull inventory listing from you guys? Can we pull compliance? And I think that, Josh was the person who kicked that all off. I mean, we spoke about Netbox briefly. That's, I think, where we started. Josh, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so we were evaluating tools, and within the company, we had a tool that we like to, from a corporate standpoint, think was the source of truth. But as Eric mentioned, the data integrity and the upkeep of it was definitely a questionable side of things that people lost trust in. And we were at a point where we needed a tool that was flexible enough to think of things more of sources of record, right? So sources of record of IP addresses or of devices or a segment of the network. We're many businesses under one umbrella. We have, our residential service side, our Cox business service side, from fiber, DOCSIS, and everything in between. And there's sources of record. And what we liked about Nautobot was that single source of truth framework and plugins that really allow us to pull in what we need from a source of record to, I would say, create a cache that is the source of truth. So it's multiple places that have definitive information about a asset, and Nautobot brings that under that single data model, and that's important to us. When you're integrating with these tools, someone else's data model becomes transformations. And really, Nautobot gives us that flexibility with the API and having that common data model that all the devices live under to make integration with other systems much easier and people integrating with us much easier.
So we've got all this information we're pulling from all these different sources of record into Nautobot, your network source of truth. Okay. And it's your single source of truth, you said, because of that, because you're pulling all that information in. But I would argue that depends on what all you're keeping in Nautobot and what you're using it for. So, Josh, you said asset management was a big thing. Are you also using Nautobot as a repository for network state, what you intend the network state to be?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Ethan, because most of our external and internal customers look at Nautobot as providing a very specific thing to them, and that is golden config compliance, right?
Right.
That app, that plugin within the Nautobot ecosystem is what they know it as. What we know it as is you have to have an inventory and backups of these devices. There's things that you need to provide those capabilities. And naturally, having that ability to do really both of those things, right? Nautobot can take backups to reach out to the devices, but getting that source of truth of all the devices not only enables our compliance capabilities, but it acts as a single inventory source for other things. So our Ansible inventories for maintenance, for security vulnerability type work, everything really centers around your inventory, right? You can't automate the network without knowing what the network is and how to get to these devices. So yeah, if you ask someone at Cox, what do we use Nautobot for? The very first thing they're going to tell you is compliance. We see it though as all of its parts and pieces.
Yeah, mainly they feel that way because they're getting graded on it.
It's a report card.
There is a carrot and a stick thing there, right? Like, so the stick is security, definitely says we need to be able to see this. And our team's done a great job of enabling security to do the things that they've been wanting to do for a very long time. And Nautobot helped us kind of allow them to see very clearly and confidently that, these devices are in compliance in these security portions of the config, right? And, because that's kind of a catalyst for us that we use to push these ideas of infrastructure as code and intent-based into the way that we manage the network. And Nautobot is a very strong platform for us to be able to try to incubate that ideal, work with some teams that maybe be a little farther along in their journey of infrastructure as code. Ideally, our end state is if we look at our network and we have, generic device X and generic domain Y, we would like to be able to manage the lifecycle of these devices with CI/CD, with source control, infrastructure as code. And, Nautobot is definitely a foundational platform for us to do those great things. But in the meantime, we need to be able to show a lot of value, and we need those sticks in place in order to kind of allow the organizational inertia to move forward. It's a huge lift to get us to do anything the same way. And this was a great opportunity for us to say, hey, we got this solution that we're doing anyway as the basis of our automation capabilities. You kind of get compliance for free. Why don't we partner and kind of push that as a standard? And that's really gotten us a very long way towards that, idealistic future that not only kind of shows that, hey, this is what can be done, but also allows our network engineers to get an operating space in which they can understand what is Jinja, what is YAML, like what is this CI/CD thing? And why are you keeping me from changing my configs? It's like, oh, well, our pipeline ran this test and it said it failed. So you need to change X, Y, and Z. And these are all things that network engineers aren't used to really working with. So that software discipline, it allows us to have like a real world scenario. And here you used to manage your device this way. Now you do it this way. And hey, guess what? This is eventually how we only want to manage our devices in the future. And so it's a great stepping stone to kind of move towards that.
David, you mentioned the having to learn Jinja and these other things, Ansible, and some of the other topics related to network engineering. Josh, you had started a program several years back that you call peer-to-peer. It was kind of like an outreach for our team where we invite some of our engineering partners to join in and we'll show them a technology or a concept, things like Jinja, YAML, Ansible, and we even had some of our engineers showcase some of their products or projects that they've been working on. So that was one of the ways that we could get them kind of up to speed on some of the things that they would need when they're interacting with Nautobot.
It's a great point. And Eric, I think you mentioned we don't want one trick ponies, right? When we buy a platform or we're buying into a technology, if those things have very domain specific languages and proprietary ways of working with them, that means we're trying to teach a group of folks one trick ponies that don't enrich the rest of their work. And things like Jinja, YAML, Ansible, those core components around just network automation tools in general, having that within the Nautobot ecosystem means they're learning a skill that they can apply in many different places that helps their daily work in and out of Nautobot. So it's key to cultivating and really creating a framework of different open source tools that enable these guys to do more and not have to have the burden of one trick ponies.
Would you guys walk us through a workflow, some more straightforward automation task that's routine that you do within Cox that your network source of truth, Nautobot in this case, is a part of?
Yeah, so this week specifically, part of config compliance for us has been decommissioning SNMP v2, right? Everything needed to be v3. We had legacy applications at certain points in EMS systems that you would think were way far ahead, but those legacy systems prevented that. So we're now at a point where we're predominantly in that SNMP v3 space. Security says, hey, we need to go ahead and get this out of the network. And part of the config compliance in Nautobot was looking for whether or not teams had converted over to SNMP v3. We had a very large network, and by very large, we're talking 65,000 managed devices that had SNMP v2 on them, right? So with Nautobot, we're able to see how many of these devices still have it, how many we've converted since like attrition, new devices were going out with the right golden config where v3 is enabled, but we still have all the brownfield, right? So a workflow for us this week involved pulling the compliance, the remediation data from the compliance app output and running that through a playbook on all 65,000 devices and decommissioning SNMP v2. So while they're getting graded on compliance, they're taking that data and able to run it back against the network and remediate the devices. And that has been, I would say, the disparity between the tools and the maturity here in our space is that we would heavily focus on tools that could tell you we were out of compliance, but have nothing that could help you get it in compliance.
Right.
So we just stayed out of compliance. And I think that we're finally reaching that point where they're trusting that the information coming back from the network and they're writing the intent, right? So the engineers are stating this is what my config should look like for SNMP v3. If it's not that, the level of trust goes up. So now they're using that data, pushing it out towards the network in ways that work for them and a maturity and a barrier to entry that is good for them, whether that's copying, pasting, Ansible, Python. We don't try to get into the specifics yet in terms of here's how you should do it. We just want them to want to do it at this point. And Nautobot's kind of the cornerstone of that.
The process for this is so much better than it used to be. Back in the day, I went through a SNMP2 to V3 project once as well, and along with a bunch of other compliance and updates and standards that were defined for the switches and routers. The way you'd know if the device was out of compliance was I'd log into it and saw someone change something that's like, guys, we talked about this. Don't do that. Or I might get a diff in the NMS that would alert me. I say, oh, hey, we see a diff. We see this line was changed. And if I'm paying attention and caught it in my deluge of email that day, like, oh, I better fix that, whatever happened there. This is it's just so much more robust. It's so much more reliable.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the way we find out usually is a customer's calling, right? We're troubleshooting the network and we're like, okay, well, on one side of the network, on the A side, the QoS looks like this, but on the Z side, it seems like it has a legacy QoS and, they have performance issues. So we would find those things and be surprised by them where the customer, unfortunately, is the alarm sometimes. And for us to get to a point where things are consistent, we're having to really look at it at scale and go and pick those things out ahead of time. And Nautobot lets us do that.
Yeah, I think what I really enjoy about what you just said, Josh, and also Eric and David, is that you're able to visualize, right? You're getting graded on it. And for anything I ever achieved, was the visualization plays such a big part to it. Whatever goal that you want, you need to be able to track it and visualize it. And so you normalize the data, and that's no small task either, right? Like you're normalizing these data from these asynchronous and differentiate sources. Then you normalize the data, then you're able to visualize it. You pass it on to other teams and make it easy for them to visualize getting graded on. Then you're able to, do all these awesome things, but you lay down the foundation in the data normalization and the storage in a scalable way. So that's all awesome. But you guys are not getting away with telling us about your DEF CON network story, because that is kind of a unique story, right? Because everybody's so friendly at DEF CON, nobody trying to hack you, right? So it must be like a super easy task, or am I wrong there? Tell us a little bit about that.
So DEF CON, I think it probably doesn't need a lot of introduction, right? It's a place where you have hackers and security researchers that have free roam of the network. And it's a lot like, I would say, handing out matches in a fireworks factory. So the way that the situation took place, this was our first year getting involved in it. They lost their venue kind of late in the game and had come into a discussion with a Cox venue, the Las Vegas Convention Center.
Yeah.
This is actually something that's serviced by one of our sister companies, HN, which is Hospitality Network. They do a lot of the Las Vegas Strip. So all the casinos and hotels that you're likely familiar with, these guys are probably plugged in there. And Las Vegas Convention Center, again, another place that probably doesn't need a lot of introduction. They host CES. So in terms of the actual network itself, the Wi-Fi, the capabilities, we all felt confident about that because this is a proven network when it comes to delivering performance. Now, when you introduce having a group of hackers and security researchers in the room for 3 days, things get a little tense, right? And Cox as a company felt tense. Our security of our customers' data is foremost when it comes to the decisions that they're making. A lot of times it makes things extra difficult, but they would always fall into that category of data safety first. And prepping for the event meant looking at the compliance of the devices, but also meant defining the compliance of the devices. So we have a golden config that operates the network. Is it secure when you have hackers all in the same room with physical access?
That's the ultimate stress test, man. That's crazy.
Yeah, these guys are pulling out Wi-Fi pineapple devices, Bluetooth hacks, USB thumb drives. If they can give physical access to that device, if we aren't being very diligent about how we locked it down, I think anyone's going to be nervous, right? And even just down to their physical location, are they behind lock and key? Are they up in the ceiling? What's our vectors and our posture across that? And DEF CON allowed us to, I would say, the full life cycle of compliance, right? Defining compliance, finding out how far away we were from compliance, getting even more shook at that, and putting it all back together, remediating it, getting it ready before that main show, and really providing a network. And as we understand it, this is the first time that the DEF CON organizers used a network that was not theirs. Traditionally, they were bringing their own gear, standing up their own Wi-Fi networks, and you would just be a backhaul. The convention center is too large for that. So we were both the provider and the access for all the actual event attendees and running the admin of it. And they were impressed with that. So not only were we looking at this as like our Super Bowl of cybersecurity, it was just a badge of honor, right? That we could show up and meet the demands of an audience like this. I mean, these are true technology folks that really are going to be discerning. And it was a proud moment. It took all of us, right? Nautobot team, network to code, as you know, is embedded in our team with the professional services. Eric and I, our security team, hospitality networks engineers, DEF CONs engineers, we're all involved in getting this thing to the success that it was.
Josh, so you would say Nautobot's role was really twofold, right? So you talked about prior to the event, there was, we don't know much about this equipment. Let's pull in some information, some backups, and let's see, are the controls in place that security says we need for this, and how many devices need to be changed if so. So that was one part. And then the other major concern and our ask from security was, hey, can you continually look at these configs to see if there's any drift during the event? So that was something that kind of pushed all of our tools to the max, right? They wanted that done. What do we end up with, hourly or sooner?
Yeah. So continuous compliance, meaning if that port was shut down and it came up in the middle of the event, someone needed to look at it, right? We were not expecting new devices to get plugged in. We'll say that. So, yeah, I think really that full life cycle is really what we were able to accomplish and see where we stood to know how much effort it was going to be, right? Everyone was wondering, do we have enough manpower to get this done? And really, the visibility of the compliance, regardless of the score ahead of time, is what gave us the plan that we were going to need to put in place the resources we needed to get it where we wanted it. And it was a fantastic event that really all of us just enjoyed being part of, I think. And the Network to Code team is really, I would say, you guys have that herd of unicorns, right? I feel like they are one of us. It doesn't feel like a vendor or a contractor. It really just feels like one of us. And that level of trust and partnership lets us do big events like a DEF CON.
I just want to interrupt real quick. I think it's very important to maybe establish this as a term. But apparently, according to AI, Google, a group of unicorns is called a blessing.
No kidding. Wow. Do they spit out like rainbows and candies and
Just makes everything better.
makes everything better?
David thinks we do, that we spit out rainbow.
A testament to Josh and Eric. I mean, literally, they've been with me for many years now. There is nothing that I can't ask them to help lead, and they don't deliver, beyond expectations every time. And I think anybody who gets an opportunity to work with them leaves happy, leaves impassioned, because they bring a lot of passion to their work. You talk about the unicorn, and like they may have a lot of rigor and experience and discipline for the network stuff, but they are a testament to even holding themselves to that same standard on the software side in terms of how they write code, how they manage code, how they try to convey best practices to people they work with. It's quite awesome, and I'm blushing on them, but they're fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, like what you said, Josh, I think this is like the Super Bowl of, just the ultimate stress test for your skill set, for your tool chains, for your security compliance, that continuous monitoring. I also want to ask you, David, how hard was it? I mean, even listening to it, I was sweating bullets, man. I was just like, oh my God, can you push this through? Was there any roadblocks in pushing this through, or were you confident? I mean, even with a successful result at the end, I want to trace back to that beginning. And what were some of your thoughts when you first encountered this project? And you're just like, well, should I do it? Or, inaction is always an option, right?
I mean, it wasn't some kind of grand opening, right? It's, hey, here, organization aligned to this big thing. It's literally a call from one of our security leaders and saying, hey, man, we got this big thing we got to do. Can you help us out? And, I had a quick powwow with my team. HN was a net new domain for us. Like it was completely unknown what we were getting ourselves into. But, a lot of times this stuff takes courage, and you just have to kind of say, hey, it's important to the business. We're here to help. Let's make it happen, right? And that's kind of what our team did, and partnered heavily with security and HN and a lot of other teams, like you mentioned, and got it done. And my job is to give them the space to do that. So we got, thousands of things that our team does every day. My job is to kind of be as agile, I'll use the term, right, as flexible as we can be, to say when these business priorities come into us, which they do all the time, we have to be able to adapt to it and change. And so this is a testament to our ability to take in that kind of work on a moment's notice and make sure that, we're doing what we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, you guys mentioned so many wins, and it's exciting and just remarkable to see the progression in that you have made so far. But I do want to ask you about what does the future hold for network automation at Cox? What are some of the challenges and aspirations? We mentioned, we talked about culture, we talked about skill set gaps, and all of these, I imagine, would be become part of that challenge in the future, right? So maybe we start with you, Eric, on what does the future hold for network automation at Cox Communications?
Well, one of the biggest things and a concept that was just so foreign to us until we met with NTC and they explained it was the whole infrastructure as code. I mean,
Mm.
Josh and I coming as network engineers for many years, it was just kind of like mind blowing. It was obvious the whole time, it's like this is how you should manage things, but it's not something that's in practice. So I think the future is seeing how much of our brownfield stuff and any new products getting deployed, can we do them in a modern infrastructure as code type manner to where compliance is something that takes care of itself, defining intent and ensuring that we stay at that with the equipment, which unfortunately means difficult things like having network engineers not log into a device directly to make a change. They need to start by defining their intent, and then the automation will take care of that. That's something that the field teams, it's going to be hard for us to get everybody on board. It's not going to be an overnight type thing just with our scale. So I think that's what it holds for us in the future, but is going to be the challenge.
What do you think, Josh? I mean, that's like taking candy away from kids, right? You're disallowing allowing in. But yeah, Josh, go ahead.
I would say they literally see it like that too, right? And
Yeah.
you have to present it in a way that they want it, right? So it has to have so much value. And maybe that value's on the edge, like their maintenance work, that they see the value in starting at the front of the process with it. So finding the in with that team, what feels comfortable to them and how they want to take that journey, I think is really the core of what we have to focus on is meeting them on their playing field because the maturity across these teams varies. Some of them have much newer platforms than others from a brownfield and greenfield perspective. And really just our leaders, right? David is very automation focused. He understands software. He's come from that space. Not all of the leaders really have that exposure, right? So we have to get them to buy into it as well so that we get the support and the resources we need. And I think really going forward, building that culture and getting buy-in is where it's going to make or break how successful we are, like what level of automation we achieve.
What do you think, David? Should we just clone Josh and Eric once it's legal?
Already working on it.
Oh, okay.
I would say my challenge, as Josh mentioned, is more organizational than
Mm.
technology, right? So, like coming from the software world, managing software through source control and systems, it's just standard, right? And so, coming here and realize, like, oh, this is the way that they manage these devices. We need to start this process of taking that management of network and do it like we do software. So, kind of introducing a lot of those things. Organizationally, there's a lot of fiefdoms in play, right? And ownership of the device is kind of tenuous between groups saying, hey, we have a group up here that says that you need to be doing these things and you ultimately own the device. It's for you traditionally to kind of decide how to make those changes and facilitate that. And, a lot of times they have to cordon off large chunks of time in order to coordinate these changes to the network. And so when you start introducing these software solutions, this stuff, it's not going to be very effective unless you're building it with the people that own the devices. So a lot of the olive branch that we're trying to extend to our fellow network engineers is, we want to kind of agree that we're going to coalesce around a system that can manage this device. But hey, guess what? We all own the system. It is collective ownership. That kind of hopefully eliminates a lot of the, fiefdoms and tribalism that you often find there. But in order to kind of get over that hump and saying, hey, we're going to do that, it does require leadership, to say, hey, we're going to, set these objectives as a company in order to get to infrastructure as code. Here's the organizational model and engagement models we're going to establish to allow us to kind of come together as a company to coalesce around these kind of systems and best practices. And then if we can get them to prioritize that in conjunction with all the other things that they care about, even more so with I need to increase my network speeds. I need to improve my reliability. I need to be more agile in the marketplace. It's taking the things that we know already contributes to that success and getting them to kind of focus on that and resource and support that and really set the direction for the company is we're going to try to establish infrastructure as code. And we understand that that foundation is what's going to give us all these fancy, great things that we talk about that looks good on slideware. It's kind of the fundamentals that we really have to get really good at as a company in order to build from. Instead of building your house on sand, we need to build it on a solid foundation that can allow us to grow into the future.
Yeah, I know for a younger Eric, if you just tell me that I could decrease, maintenance window, I could actually get it done, then I'm in, right? Like if you're just talking about how to influence and win friends, that's, speaking from their perspectives. So I love everything that you guys talked about, David, Josh, and Eric. So I want to take a moment and ask if there's anything that you feel like we need to cover and we haven't covered because we are up on the time here. So I want to give us a chance to bridge that gap here if we need to.
We know that exposure to folks internally at MSOs is always limited. So we would just ask if you or Ethan have questions for us that you think your audience might be interested in. We'd love to field a couple questions from you.
Yeah, especially since everything is not unicorns and rainbows as some people would think. So
Yeah, I think I'm good here coming from, like the Doxys background, even though it was Doxys 1.0 or pre-Doxys. But, I do understand the different components that you guys were talking about. And, I was that guy who was going out on truck roads with people. And if they allowed me to climb poles, I would. But, insurance didn't allow that. So I'm kind of biased toward that. But I'm wondering if, Ethan, you have anything that you want to ask that we haven't covered.
I have one. Is QoS still a thing? And if it is, do you automate it?
Yeah, I mean, QoS is definitely a thing, especially on the Cox Business Network. So we're providing transparent LAN services. It's a MPLS-based network, and QoS to control bandwidth and quality of service. And I mean, everything in between, still a big thing, still something that we're automating as it goes in, a new device goes in, trying to catch up on all the legacy devices. So anything we can touch that involves QoS, because that is an easy way to get a truck roll or have an alarm from a customer is, hey, I'm not getting the type of performance that I'm expecting. And you can pull your hair out, right, with traversing multiple networks and QoS, tagging, labels, everything's getting popped on, popped off. And before you know it, we're confused as engineers where the automation is something that we need. We just have to get there faster in a lot of cases.
I've taught enterprise QoS, and my first slide is usually, you probably need more bandwidth, not QoS. So if you think you're going to solve a bandwidth problem with QoS, you're not. And I was wondering if in 2024, we'd finally gotten to the point where, yeah, we hardly ever use QoS anymore because we have so much bandwidth. It's fine. It sounds like no.
No, I would definitely say even with huge amounts of bandwidth available to our network, there's still that prioritizing packets and getting it across the network in a way that is low latency and really delivering services that customers basically can feel connected from business to business, like they're in the same data center across the country. So I think for us, QoS is still going to be a thing. We can deliver big bandwidth, though. That is something that we're very good at and something that I think we should be very proud of with our network is the scaling is something we're proud of.
and protecting important services too. Like we use it on voice in the core to make sure that nothing can stomp on voice. And even one of the latest things was going back and ensuring it's on all management traffic, because it's not a good situation if you have a management system that suddenly clobbers the network because it can. So there's a lot of spots where QoS is still your last line of defense if done correctly. That's the key, if done correctly.
It's hard. It is hard. And in fairness, a network like yours is a different animal with different requirements than even a large enterprise network. Really big enterprise networks, I think, tend to look a lot more like service provider networks. But, mid and so on enterprises just have different concerns where QoS, you can do it, but because it's hard and the technical debt that comes up and all the differences between devices and needing to understand queuing theory behind every chipset and all the rest, it's like, if you don't have to, just don't. Just throw more bandwidth at it if you can. Anyway, that's an aside, Eric.
I think you're right, Ethan. I think the MSO is such a different network and just a different beast with great power with the semi-monopoly that you have, right? Like especially for voice, for 911 calls and for the spectrums that were reserved by emergency services, then gets leaked. I would still remember it was like a Sev 1 if anybody have detected like a leakage of signals and all of that. So definitely true. I think what I took away from our conversation today, and I'm very impressed about, is I think your team and your organization, but I've exposure to your team, is that it's such a knowledge-based team, and it's such a open team for whether it's peer-to-peer, that movement that you started, or it's pair programming. It's just a knowledge-based team, and that's gonna prepare you well for I think whatever you guys venture into. So that's very impressive.
Yeah, that gives us the confidence that we've talked about before of just like racing into the darkness and helping us, figure out problems.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So before we close, can you tell us where we could follow your work, all the projects, all the best work that you guys do, maybe on social, maybe not. So why don't we start with you, David? Where can people follow your work or best way to find you on social?
Not really a big social media guy. I don't do a lot of presence there. You follow the work by working for me. So we love really talented network engineers that are passionate about automation. So if you guys are interested in that and the stars align, then come hit me up on LinkedIn.
Fair enough. What about you, Josh?
Yeah, for me, you can find me on GitHub under NetOps Engineer, and that's the easiest way to contact me. Same for me. I don't do a whole lot of social media, but find me on there. You can find my email and pretty much any of the Network to Code Slack channels. You'll find me lurking there. And if you have questions, reach out. We'd love to hear from you.
Josh is accepting PRs. Cool.
Yeah.
What about you, Eric? Are you the odd man out in this group that actually does social, even LinkedIn?
I'm pretty heavy on my LinkedIn.
Okay.
And anyone's welcome to message me on LinkedIn. I welcome conversation. And Josh said, check my commit history.
Badge of honor there.
For sure. But yeah, just hit me up on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Hey, I just want to thank you guys again for being here. And, thank you for listening to this episode of Network Automation Nerds. If you have any feedbacks for Network Automation, our guest today, or this episode, send us some follow-ups at packetpushers.net/follow-up. And we really want to hear from you. Again, I want to thank our guests, Josh, Eric, and David today, and our sponsor, Network to Code, for this episode. So thank you guys. If you want to learn more about Network to Code, Cox Communication, the links are in the show notes. And I want to thank my co-host today, Ethan Banks. You've brightened up this episode. Thank you for your presence. And last but not least, remember that too much network automation will never be enough.